discussion, we're going to move to the panel discussion, and the topic is titled Examining Questions of Equity and Utility for Indigenous Patients Living with End-Stage Organ Failure with Dr. Caroline Tait, Dr. Aviva Goldberg, Terri Gardener, and Dr. Veronica McKinney. Caroline Tait holds a PhD in medical anthropology from McGill University and is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry, University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Tait is a member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan and grew up in a small Métis community in central Saskatchewan. With Dr. Michael Moser, Dr. Tait established the Saskatchewan First Nation and Métis Organ Donation and Transplantation Network, made up of knowledge keepers, persons with lived experience, researchers, physicians, and students. Aviva Goldberg is a transplant nephrologist and ethicist in Winnipeg. She's the section head of pediatric nephrology and the associate dean, UGME Student Affairs, and associate professor at the Max Rady College of Medicine at the University of Manitoba. She's the secretary of the Canadian Society of Transplantation and a member of CDTRP Things 1 and 5. Terri Gardener is a Cree-speaking Métis woman from northern Saskatchewan, as well as a 10-year breast cancer survivor who travels around the province to provide assistance, information, and support to Indigenous patients who are trying to access and navigate the cancer care system. A former provincial and federal government employee, she started working with the Saskatoon Health Region as an Aboriginal client advocate shortly after she was diagnosed with cancer. It was while going through the cancer care system on her own that she saw a great need to be filled. Today, Terri is the knowledge keeper for the Saskatchewan Cancer Care Agency, Saskatchewan Health Authority, and Saskatchewan Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. Dr. Veronica McKinney is the director of Northern Medical Services, a department of the College of Medicine, University of Saskatchewan. Veronica is of Cree Métis descent and provides leadership in health development, working with rural and remote northern Saskatchewan Indigenous communities, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, and various health organizations, tribal councils, and bands to support and promote the continued evolution and advancement of healthy communities, families, and people. She's an assistant professor and chair of the Indigenous Health Committee, College of Medicine, University of Saskatchewan. I'll now pass it on to Caroline, who will be moderating this panel.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm just going to ask Terri, who's our elder, to open us with a prayer. And before we do that, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land. And I noticed that we have some guests that joined us, and thank you for being here. And we're so happy to be guests on this territory. So Terri, I'll let you.
In our Indigenous culture, we always ask our Creator to help us, so we will move in a positive way. And I'm going to read something, and I'm going to say a prayer in my language. This is for a prayer for organ donors. We pray that you will bless the lives of those who are organ donors. Without them, there is no hope and there is no transplant. May they be blessed for their compassion to restore life for those who are critically ill. Anos kagisagak mantum nan kinto tamat tamiu mamawapia utakawaskapia tamiu itioaganituya tatamiu pai kahkiogi gwainitini haunana kitse kahkio pugutasitus katuya ksisan makahkiogi gwetamiu payo. Hi.
Thank you, Terri. So this panel should be called Aviva and the Métis. So, so you've got three Métis people here who work in health, and Dr. Goldberg is with us. We're very, very happy. And this isn't a presentation as much as it is a Q&A. And I've made some questions for our panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more, but I can tell you this is that these are three very wonderful, wonderful people. And Veronica and Terri and I have known each other for years, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know Aviva as time goes on. And so as a Métis, I grew up in my community. And so some of you have heard me talk about the health inequities that exist. I now live in the north. Terri lives in the north, and the north is the norm. And what's so wonderful about having Veronica here, who's joining us online, is she's the head of Northern Medical Services in the province of Saskatchewan, and meets regular with federal ministers, and is in that larger discussion about inequities that exist and how do we improve healthcare. And Veronica works very closely with a colleague of ours, Dr. Ivor Mendez, who works in remote presence technologies, and how I think in organ donation and transplantation, that's an interesting area that we can explore. So I think, and as I said before, you might kind of wonder looking at me, and where I'm from, Métis women do not turn gray. We turn blonde as we age. so yeah. But anyway, I once had with the national chief, Ovid Mercurdy. He wasn't national chief, but we were walking one day together. I had just met him, and I wanted to talk to him about fetal alcohol syndrome. And I was so keen to talk to him about pregnant women and alcohol and all this stuff. And he looked at me and he said, do you dye your hair? And I said, yeah, it makes me look less tired. So anyway, so I tried to look less tired. So the first question that I have for our panelists is, what do you feel are the barriers or gaps in healthcare that prevent First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients from being placed on the transplant list and receiving a transplant? And I think we're going to begin with Terri.
I'll tell you a little bit about myself first, so you'll have an idea. I'm from Northern Saskatchewan. I'm a proud Métis. I'm married for 50 years. And 20 years was trial marriage, like common law. And I have 2 daughters and I have 3 grandsons I love so much. And we just 2 years ago, we adopted a baby who was meth addicted. And he's brought us so much joy. And I know God gave us a gift. I worked hard all my life to have a good life. So my kids will never see the life I was raised in. So 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And like anybody, I was really scared to die. So I asked God for guidance, and I asked God that I will do whatever it takes in my power to change the system. The healthcare system does not work for us Indigenous people. And my mother she was a diabetic, and she was on dialysis, and we had to travel 6 hours, 4 hours on gravel roads to go to the city to get dialysis. And she ended up dying, complications of diabetes. And through my journeys where I saw people struggling, my people were really struggling. They faced a lot of challenges. Yes, there was signs all over, but if you can't read or write, how are you going to know which department to go? And so I used to talk to the CEO of the cancer care, and I used to say to him, I'll be your Walmart greeter, because there's no brown face, no Indigenous person when you walk into the cancer care. It's scary as it is. So at 2014, I started lobbying, sitting in every council I can as a family patient advisory, so I can make a difference. And cancer has brought me nothing but good. Yes, I suffered, I nearly died, but I know I've made a difference when people come up to me and kiss my hand and say, it's so powerful what you said, because I speak fluent Cree. So when I speak, just like French or Ukrainian, you speak your language is more powerful. You can make people understand more. And we go with a Northern Health Education bus, like AIDS, anybody that wants to come with us, we take. And we sometimes in the summertime, we do 23 communities, and a lot of them are remote areas. and we talked to 4,500 people. And it's really nice because we gather, we visit, we talk, and we eat, and food brings you comfort, joy. So I started engaging in communities, and storytelling. People love to tell stories, and people that have lived experiences even more powerful when you're speaking. As to your question, Caroline, because of the geographical region we live in, and the road conditions, and the cost of gas, it's really hard for people. A lot of people don't have vehicles, so they can't just jump into their vehicle and take off. They have to think what they're going to do, their next step, because a lot of our people have fixed income. So if you get cancer or you get diabetes, there's no extra money. You just have what you have to survive. A lot of people have to think they have to either take their medication, buy their pills, or buy their food. So they have a lot of challenges. And what else? And like I said, the travel, the cost, the language barriers, another thing. And most Indigenous people will never, ever ask their family member to donate a kidney. Never. That's unheard of. And a lot of people, it's not my Métis belief, but I know First Nations believe they have to be buried whole. So you can't take a kidney out. I don't know if that will change, but that's the way it is today. And we struggle lots, and we just keep going and try to get as much information and take it back to our communities. And I also do a radio talk show. That's why they call me Indian Oprah. I do talk shows, and I try to get as many people as I can involved and give the information, because I worked at Saskatoon Health Region. I knew nothing about cancer. I was lucky where I worked because I went to work. I went downstairs on a Thursday, arranged my chemo, and I was very, very sick. And then I go home for the weekend, recuperate, back to work. I never missed work in the 2 years I was getting my treatment, because I was bound and determined to survive, to help my people. And yeah, I think that's all I have for that question.
And Aviva, we'll go to you next.
Okay, thank you. And a tough act to follow, Oprah. I will do my best. Thank you, Terri. So as Carolyn said, I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm Jewish. I was born in Winnipeg. I've lived most of my life in Winnipeg. I'm very, very grateful to be a guest on that territory, and where I can live and work and play and raise my family, and that this land has offered a place of privilege and safety for my family as we've been going through life. And I'm going to share a story about my family now. It's not about Indigenous people, and it's not about transplanting. You'll kind of wonder why I'm telling you this story, but I hope to bring it back to both those things in a minute. So this summer, my family and I went to Wisconsin Dells. We had an amazing vacation, sunshine and roller coasters and water slides. And I guess, as it turns out, maybe one too many chicken wings, because as we came home and we were getting ready to send my younger son off to summer camp, and my husband went off to play in his old timer softball league. They'd only let him in because he was just barely old enough to be in this league, but he got in, and he is a white guy, Italian, Irish Catholic guy, came home from the baseball tournament and said, I just feel kind of anxious about Isaac going to camp tomorrow. And I've got this weird feeling in the back of my throat. And being a doctor, I said, okay, well, what do you mean weird feeling? Is it pain? He said, no. I said, do you have pain in your left arm? Do you have pain in your jaw? All these things. And he said, no. And we kept packing for camp. And then about half an hour later, he's still not feeling well. And I'm like, I think we should just run by the emergency room, make sure that you're doing okay. And as many of you in the audience who are familiar with atypical chest pain will know, that weird feeling in the back of his throat was a heart attack. He was having a serious heart attack. He was in the cath lab within an hour, 2 stents, started on 5 new medications, in the hospital for 2 days. And then we went home. He did a cardiac rehab program. He's doing great now. But it was a tough summer. So why do I tell you this story? This episode was very, very difficult for us. It's been traumatic in a lot of ways for us as a family, but it was also packed with so much hidden privilege. So when you think about every step of our journey, okay, yes, he has a doctor wife who knew about atypical chest pain. We'll put that to the side, but let's say he was just the average Winnipeg white guy. What are the things that he had that privileged him so much in that situation? We live 8 minutes from the best cardiac center in the province. I could just drive him there. People tell me I should have sent him in an ambulance, but anyway, we got him there really, really fast. When he went into the emergency room, nobody thought because of the way he looked or the color of his skin that he was there to warm up or that he was drunk, which is what happened to Brian Sinclair in the same city that I live in not that long ago. Different emergency room, but same city, who had a very treatable bladder infection and died in the emergency room before being seen. When we were in Winnipeg, so is all of my family. His family lives elsewhere, but all my family and friends were immediately there to help us with the things that we needed to get through. We didn't have family way far away who couldn't come down and be with us while this was going on. We paid for his medications out of pocket until my university, benefits kicked in, but we could afford that. And we didn't have to prove to somebody our Indigenous status that we were Indigenous enough to have a treaty card to pay for our medications. Our cardiac rehab program wasn't covered by our insurance, but we had the money to pay for that. And again, 10 minutes down the road from our house, we didn't have to go far away from home to access the care he needed to get better. And just every single step of the way, there were built-in things that didn't mean that this wasn't hard for us. It was very, very hard. But how could it have been so much harder? And so kind of examining that idea of how on so many steps of the journey, we were very privileged and were people who were in many ways like us, but maybe didn't have those privileges would have been treated or affected differently. And so I think when we bring that back to transplant, we can see that there are many similar parallels, right? Terri talked about this with the remoteness, with the access to therapy, with the access to the preventative therapy that could prevent some types of end organ disease, not all, but some types, the access to transplant assessment, the access to waiting lists, the access to living donors, that these things are all affected by so many, some obvious, but so many non-obvious areas where there are things that we need to interrogate as where areas of privilege. And so that's kind of where I want to tell my story. And I think that when you ask the question about where the gaps are, they're everywhere. They're every step along the journey. And we just have to be open our eyes to recognizing that and to addressing them.
Veronica, I'll turn it over to you now.
Hi there. Wow, 2 tough acts to follow. Anyways, yeah. So one of the things I wanted to say was that when we're talking northern Saskatchewan here, we're talking the northern half of the province. And I've had the privilege of working in BC and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario. I'm from Saskatchewan, but it's not unlike, I think there's a lot of similarities in most of our communities for sure. I would say that, in terms of the healthcare system itself, there's a lack of access, and you've heard that, and the privilege that there is for those who are non-Indigenous versus those who are Indigenous. For the idea of racism is also the big ticket here. The system is not set up for Indigenous and First Nations people, and we can see that they are not part of the consideration. It doesn't work for many of our people. And, it's built on a colonial system. There have been much research done on this. There's much going on, but we really haven't addressed the systems in any way that is meaningful. I think, of course, there's interpersonal racism. There's even intrapersonal in terms of people not feeling like they deserve the care that they should be getting. I think the other reality for many people living in rural or remote northern communities, particularly living on reserve, is that they have to go through many layers of bureaucracy in order to even access the care. So for instance, if I'm living on reserve in the north, I have to get approval for travel to go down south. And you have to give at least 72 hours before you can get that travel approved, even though you might be able to get an appointment the next day. You're taking up at least 3 days often to go down and come back. And the bias that's associated with that, I always remember a physician that I overheard, mentoring a student and saying, no worries. So, those people, they get, you know, a flight down and they get put up in a hotel and they get their meals paid for. It's all great. The way he was describing it was like, I'm sure what a vacation would be like. It is far from that. It is a horrendous experience. And most people that would have to go through that would not want to do that. Often riding, you know, as Terri said, if you're in a vehicle for 6 hours with a whole van load of other people who are not feeling well, you don't get stops for meals. You get very little in terms of even access to what kind of meals you have. If you do have to stay in a hotel, it's often in the poor end of town. For many of our people living up north, it's very noisy and they're not used to that, so they don't often sleep well. It's also things like the physicians that are serving our communities often are coming in and out of the communities. Even though we do in Northern Saskatchewan, we have several physicians that live in the main communities where they're working out of. They rotate to different outlying communities. And they also, nobody works part-time, full-time anymore. There's a change or shift in how our physicians and nursing staff are working these days. And none of them work full-time. They work very few days. In some cases, you know, not even 180 days would be considered a full-time position in most of our sites in the north. So it really means that you don't have an opportunity to build relationship because there's a lack of consistency. The downside to working in primary care teams, if you don't have consistency, is that you're getting a rotation of different people coming through, whether that's nurses, physicians, or other healthcare providers. And so that makes it difficult as a provider coming in to really get to know your patient, especially for organ transplant, to understand what's going on and what their likes are, or what their knowledge is, how to advocate. It really means that that patient falls through the cracks. And as a provider, it's difficult to be able to do that for sure. And then there's also this inability, I would say, of many of our First Nations and Métis people to be able to participate in their own healthcare in a meaningful way. You know, again, going back to colonialism, a lot of what's happening is based on the idea that Indigenous people are wards or, you know, of the crown, of that we are, you know, wards of the state, so to speak. So we don't have a lot of decision making within the system. We're not incorporated into the system. You know, even now when they do have offices of the First Nations and Métis, it's sort of a little offshoot, but it's not really the main piece of things. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we are not really looking at the system in a way that, how do we change this? We're talking about, you know, training people and making people culturally safe, or, you know, making sure there's anti-racism training. But the reality is, when we do these things, often we're teaching the culture to the privileged. And one of the things I brought up recently is the fact that our communities have been raped of their culture. It's very difficult for many people to be able to go back and try to learn what the cultural ways are. I think one of the advantages we have in the north, as Terri said, in northern Saskatchewan, is more than 65% of our population speak a language other than English as their first language. And that's really strong for culture. The ability to be on the land, the ability to you know, kind of live more of a traditional life in many ways. But we do know that if you have a strength in culture, that your health is generally better. And I think we also have to look back to what are the things that lead Indigenous people to being on those transplant lists in the first place. And when you really look at this, we're talking about things like trauma, and that's related to the colonialism, the lack of ability to access social determinants of health, things like having a regular, nutritious food source. And many of our traditional foods are more on the side of the low carb or ketone diet. And that's not what we have access to nowadays. People don't have money to pay for food, and the foods that they're getting are very high carbohydrate, which, as we know, changes to sugar. And a lot of people don't know that when they're eating, when they're making those choices, or if they even have choices. And I think a lot of the decisions around transplant is around people believing that the outcome that people are experiencing are based on the choices they've made throughout their life. But when you haven't had choice throughout your life, what you're ending up with is a horrible situation where you didn't have choice, and now you're at end of life. And how do you begin to navigate that when you haven't had choice throughout your whole life? So there's a huge amount of education. There's a huge amount of review that we need to do on a systemic level. That really does need to have meaningful engagement and relationship with our communities. I too have multiple stories. I see it time and again. I'm also a family physician who's worked emergency for many years, and I have gone back. I'm more doing family med now, but I work in the inner city. And the joke is that even with the inner city people that I work with, they too have a lack of access. Even understanding, the terminology, being able to speak. I have to laugh. I do speak some Cree, but my translation is more often English to English for people. And the idea of educating people or talking so they understand what's going on, and then can make the choices. And that's an unusual situation for many of my patients. Many of my patients had no idea of what was going on. They just know what they were told, and here's what they need to do. When we think of our system and how it's built in terms of family physicians, we're nowadays, everybody's busy and you only can deal with one problem at a time. Well, I've had patients say, well, what do I do? I've got 15 different things I need to deal with. And again, these are complex patients. So in the midst of our crises right now in the healthcare system, complex patients are being dumped off because you can't deal with them fast. And so we need to have a way to be able to really address our patients who are complex, but really do need that help nonetheless and are capable. So I think I'll just leave it at that. But, there's a lot of different areas here that we need to explore and a lot to unpack that are really leading to a complete difference in how the access to care is being presented to our First Nations and Métis and Inuit populations for sure.
And Terri, this reminds me of the story about the lady in the van. I don't know if you feel comfortable telling it. Yeah.
I get lots of stories told to me on my travels because they have no one to complain to. And they always say, you have a big mouth, so I know you'll do something. So there was one lady there that got discharged. That's another thing, when there's no plan once they get home, the discharge. There was a lady that was in a medical taxi in a van. And she was the only lady there. The rest were all men. I think she said there was about 7 men. It was an 8-passenger van. And she said close to about quarter way, she said she started leaking from her, she's a cancer patient. And she said they didn't give me anything. So she said, we stopped at this one gas station. We asked for a garbage bag, and it's big black garbage bag. She asked one of the guys to hold it. Can you imagine how embarrassing that was for her? And she still had to go from there. She still had to go another 5 hours. So it lots of sad stories. There was another one that was told to me. A grandma kept her grandkids and she never drank in her life. One of them got really sick, so she took the baby to the hospital, and she was with her other grandson. So they were looking at the doctor writing a prescription, and here he made a beer bottle, the prescription, a picture of a beer bottle, like she's drinking, and she never drank. So there's a lot of issues like that. But people don't speak up. They don't do anything because they're scared of probably a lot of it is residential school. They do not speak up about anyone with authority. It still happens to this day. Yeah, I think, yeah. I thought I had another one. Yeah.
So the next question I have, and please at this point, if people have questions and you want to go to the mic, please do so. This is very informal. So, so from what you've described, what are the most pressing issues to address? And how do we think the healthcare system and transplant programs could reduce the gaps and barriers? And I guess the point here is that we realize that a lot of what we're talking about falls outside of the mandate of transplant programs, right? So as a group of transplant and donation experts, what do you do with these bigger issues when you see patients struggling? And so I think I'll turn it over to Aviva to start with that question.
So yeah, a really big question. And I think, obviously does have answers that are both within and outside of the transplantation and donation space. But I think what I would challenge us to do is to make sure that any policy that we have, be it around allocation, assessment, whatever, that we explicitly decide we are going to look at it from an equity lens, and specifically in Canada, an equity lens that includes consideration of Indigenous people. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you a couple examples. So Aaron Trachtenberg and I wrote a paper, and Carolyn and I've talked about this paper, about how organ allocation for deceased donor kidney transplants in most of Canada, it's based partly on your match, but also a lot about waiting time. The date you start dialysis is kind of when your waiting time starts. And we argued that it's a bit of a blunt instrument, and that people who have to move from their community to a bigger center to get dialysis, that their waiting time might be equal in days to the other people on the waiting list, but it's not equal in terms of experiences, that it might have an extra burden on people who are forced to relocate in order to be able to get those services, and that perhaps that could be worked into an allocation system to give some extra priority to people who have to relocate from other parts of Canada to big urban centers to get their dialysis. So that would be an example of a policy that kind of includes that consideration of equity in it. But it doesn't have to be policies just like that. It could be things like the voucher policy. So my friend and former classmate, Jeff Veal, who's now a urologist at UCLA, put together this really innovative program because one of his pediatric patients had a kidney disease that was going to one day, that kid was going to need a transplant, but not while he was a kid. He was 4 or 5 when this happened. And he wasn't probably going to need that kidney transplant until he was in his late teens or maybe early 20s. And his grandfather wanted to be his kidney donor, but said, right now I'm young and healthy enough to do that. In 10, 15 years, I probably won't be. So how's about I give a kidney to someone on the deceased donor waiting list now, and you give us a voucher. And then when our kid needs a kidney transplant when he's 15 or 20, he moves to the top of the list, or he gets an altruistic donor or whatever, some way that he benefits from my donation down the road. And this voucher program is really innovative and really interesting. But imagine, like in the last presentation, we heard this in relation to Black people, and I would argue that the same is likely true for Indigenous populations. We've heard this from Terri and from Carolyn already, that system relies on a huge amount of trust to say, I'm going to give you a kidney and you're going to give me a piece of paper that I can bring back in 15 years and get another kidney. How much trust do you have to put into that system? And is that going to be something that Indigenous people are going to agree to do? And if it isn't, then how do we work on that system? So not to throw out a really good idea, the voucher system is a great idea, but how do we include Indigenous perspectives and how we're going to make that program available to and interesting to Indigenous people to participate in? And then there's stuff kind of in the middle where you could say, well, this could be really equity focused, but we have to definitely think more about it. So like the programs that are starting in a lot of places where they'll do a one-day workup for kidney donors, like they'll do all the tests they need to be donors, in a day at the hospital. University of Ottawa, they're trialing a really interesting program in that. That sounds great, right? Somebody from northern Saskatchewan or northern Manitoba or remote parts of Ontario or Quebec could come to the big center, get everything that they need done in one day. Bam, you're approved, you're a kidney donor. And it is, in some ways, a really great idea for people living in remote parts of the province. But as we heard in the book club yesterday, people are talking about how sometimes Indigenous people, because of trust issues and because of lots of other issues, might need some time to think about the decisions. So you could do a one-day workup and get all the medical things done, but you have to build into that. What if somebody's not ready to say yes on that day? What if they need some time to think about their decision and to talk with elders and to talk with their community before agreeing? So something that could be super equity focused, but also needs to be considered from an Indigenous lens. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about, is kind of what Ibram Kendi wrote a book, and he's a Black American. He wrote a book from that perspective, saying that any policy, and he wasn't talking obviously specifically about transplant or about health, but he said that any policy that you look at, it's either racist or anti-racist. that if it's not explicitly anti-racist, that is actually a racist policy. And he's been criticized as that being a bit too much of a blunt instrument, but I think it has a lot of value for us to think about, are our policies explicitly equity focused? And if they're not, how do we get them to that point? So that's kind of where I would target our efforts, is making sure that our procedures and policies are specifically looked at from an equity lens, and in Canada, one that includes the voices of Indigenous people.
Veronica?
Hi, what she said.
That's exactly.
I would absolutely agree. I think we need to have a good, harsh look at our current systems and to really look at them from an equitable access approach. Having said that, I'm also I'm a big pragmatist. So one of the things, I will give you an example of something that we've done or tried to work on in Northern Saskatchewan. And, you know, I love that saying, if you can't get Muhammad to the mountain, you got to bring the mountain to Muhammad. And this is where, as Carolyn was alluding to before, we've looked at virtual care and using technology as a way to really overcome some of these barriers, the physical barriers that are existing. So one of the effects of using virtual care, first off, when I say virtual care, I'm not saying that we're going to replace going to community. We need face-to-face interaction, but this is a good way to bridge. And especially, you know, as Aviva was saying, in terms of ensuring, like, you know, if people, like, not forcing people to make a decision right then and there and trying to jam pack everything into one sole visit and that's it. The other piece to this is when you actually are able to meet with a person, even if it's virtually, in their own environment, whether that even be at a nursing station in their own community, the reality is there's generally somebody there that can speak the language. There's somebody there, you can have your family there with you. I mean, this is the other thing, when you're traveling down, you're by yourself. And when you're already, you know, tired and sick and scared, these are not ideal conditions to take in information. If you've ever taken a teaching class, you know this is like the worst situation to take in information. So you can have your family there. They can ask the questions. They can be the advocates. They can really help you to digest and process what's going on, for sure. And I think a lot of that aspect of the access and the education and the involvement of community and family is much stronger when you can do this in that manner. And what we did find is that not only was there education, but people felt much more empowered. The families felt empowered. The patient felt empowered. They could talk about this a lot more. They could make those decisions and feel like they were doing it as a community, because in many of our ways, we do this, we process things in a family way. We don't just do this on our own. We think about how it's going to affect everybody. And, you know, there is this assumption that many Indigenous people are fatalistic, that, you know, and you will hear that from some of our Kiteak, from some of our elders, that, well, if this is meant to be, it's meant to be. But, you know, again, taken in the context of having to travel back and forth and back and forth, and when you're facing that and facing this alone most of the time without your family, many will choose that they want to spend the time that they have with their family. So if we can find a way to bring the service to them versus otherwise, that's a way of doing it. And we're also looking at using the virtual care. So we've got a little something called Doc in the Box or Nurse in the Purse, whatever you want to call it. But it is a virtual way of connecting. And so one of the ideas that we've had is connecting, having a room where people can come in and actually do some dialysis without you know, the need of a nurse or anything. It's in the hospital. It's, you know, they can get help if they need, but also by having that virtual care, they can literally click into the dialysis unit in the tertiary care center and get help if they need. They can ask questions if they need. So it kind of expands your ability to be able to provide the services and do it again where people feel comfortable. And actually in the community where Terri's from, that's what they're looking at doing, is trying to provide some of these kinds of services right where the people are. And I think as we work more on that level, I think we will learn more. The other piece to this virtual care is, what I have found is the providers on the other end are also learning the assumptions that they made about the communities, what's available, what's not available, you know, how things are done or the processes. They've learned an immense amount as well. In fact, I have one provider that went on to do a master's because she just felt like her mind was like mind blown. I need to learn more about this. And so I think really what we're talking about is a real relationship where we're learning from each other and we're really actually working together and getting to know each other. You know, I think the more that we can bring ourselves together in whatever way we need to, that we will learn these things from one another, and that the process will happen in a much more smooth way for sure. So system change for sure. And we need to start looking at alternative ways of approaching things, bottom line.
Thanks. And that reminds me of, so some of you know this and others may not, but we ran for 3 years, although 2 of those during COVID, which made it difficult, but it actually turned out to be beneficial in some ways. But both Veronica and Terri were on our First Nations and Métis organ donation and transplantation think tank. And so one of the things that colonialism did to our communities, so we talk a lot about loss of culture, but it was also, there was a loss of collective intelligence. And so when we started with Mike and you know, talking to Veronica, Mike Moser, and we decided to create this think tank, and there was no Indigenous people working in this area except Mary was there, and there's also another Mary Smith who's at Kingston, but there was really this national landscape of which there were no Indigenous voices. And so we decided to do a thought experiment, and that was to create this think tank. And then what we did is we had different people at that time in Saskatchewan who were healthcare providers. But then with COVID, it opened it up, and some of you came and spent time with us, and it was an open invitation. And so I always laugh at John Gill. So John Gill came and presented, but John would pop in. And he said to us one time, I can get more from just coming and sitting with you. And Melanie was popping in all the time. But I can get more coming and sitting with you and listening to you debate this than I can taking any kind of cultural safety training or anything like that. And so that dialogue, so I wore my sash today. This is a traditional Métis sash, and this is about knowledge, right? So it's a metaphor for the ways in which we need to proceed with Indigenous peoples, is that there's different knowledges that need to be woven together. And our people are dying. So people are dying, and not only are they dying because they need a transplant, but they're dying. People aren't getting amputations. So we have the highest rate of amputation in First Nations people in northern Saskatchewan. The rates are crazy. And so there's all of these inequities. So if we're going to address them, so as we sit here today, we have a few First Nations people here, and a few Métis. We have no Inuit here, at this national conference. And so why is that? And so I wanna say this, just to dedicate this to someone who I think we all should know about, and we should continue to think about this person, and that's Mr. David Dennis, who was a Nuu-chah-nulth man from British Columbia. We're in British Columbia, and he needed, as you know, a liver transplant, and there were questions around alcohol use. And what was interesting about Mr. David Dennis is that he was an activist, a First Nations activist. And so normally many of our people wouldn't ask about why he wasn't being placed on the transplant list. But because he was an activist, he challenged not only the science and the medicine around the 6-month abstinence rule, but he also reminded people that in this country, the optimal conditions through colonialism created these inequities. Indigenous people did not create the inequities. The inequities are the biggest determinant of health for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in this country is government policy. And so he challenged that. And he said, you're withholding health care after you created this context. So where is the reconciliation? And so I really want to acknowledge the work that he did and the questions that he raised. And we shouldn't forget what his goal was. And his goal was, again, to make it to make more of an equitable health system. So that now begs the question to our panels here. Where do First Nations, Métis and Inuit health leaders, our elders and our patients fit into solutions? Where do Indigenous voices come through? And not to forget that Indigenous people are rights holders. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, treaty rights, inherent rights. So how does that fit into this conversation? And the deemed consent is a really presumed consent is a perfect example of where, from an Indigenous point of view, that you may have more people through a deemed consent legislation donating organs, but if you don't address the equity issues, people are still not getting transplants. Right. So that's an example. So who wants to go first around our leadership? Terri?
I'll go back to the question of what the both ladies said. That's what I was going to say. No, I'm just kidding. I don't even remember what I did this morning. So how am I going to remember the question? My daughter's always, I say it's chemo brain, but my daughters say it's my age. So I just want to say there's just a few things that I, like Veronica said, the healthcare system does not work for us. We need more support. They need to hire more Indigenous people, more people that when you go in, they can assist you, they can navigate you through the system. And a lot of them will speak the language. And like, since COVID, I've noticed, especially the cancer patients, and it doesn't matter if it's cancer patients or people that are on dialysis. There's so much mental health issues come out of COVID because of the in isolation. And also, if we could do, COVID proved that we could do virtual medical appointments. It's in their comfort zone. They feel comfortable when their family are sitting there. They can explain to them in simple language that what the doctor is saying. So that's what I was going to say. But the next question you asked me, leaders need to get more financial support. More elders need to get involved in the healthcare system. And we need to support our leadership and tell them that what it is that they need, because as I worked for government for 4 to 5 years, nobody listened to me. It's the leadership that negotiate our healthcare system, that those are the people that can make a difference and really engage our communities. We have to educate people. Like when I was diagnosed for cancer, I didn't know nothing about cancer. If you don't know, you don't know. We need to educate people and our people, Indigenous people, need to be more involved. This organ donor, and we need to understand where we can work together. That I promise I will push every talk I do. I will, like I have been for the last year, and I'll continue doing that. Yeah, no, that's all I have.
Aviva, do you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think what she said, but I think every step of the way we need to tap into the immense amount of support in Indigenous communities for themselves and their community members, and figure out how we best leverage that in a donation and transplant space. Carolyn and I have talked about this before, that it is hard. There are other problems that affect more people in these communities than organ and tissue donation and transplantation, right? Diabetes, mental health, cancer, heart disease. These are bigger in terms of the numbers of people affected. So we have to make our voice, a small voice or organ and transplant voice, loud at those tables and engage with the people who can help. But I think kind of understanding the immense amount of power that comes from these communities and tapping into it in terms of the lessons we can learn, the ways we can understand Indigenous ways of knowing better as we navigate these spaces. Those are going to be the ways. And I think Veronica alluded to this a little bit, that we're not just talking about taking care of individual patients. This is actually nation to nation discussion, right? If we had a patient coming from the US who for some reason needed a transplant in Canada, or from Denmark, we would recognize that they come not as an individual, not only as an individual, but that there might be issues related to the nation from which they come that would affect our decision making. So understanding that that is how it is for many Indigenous people in Canada, is that they are part of nations, and how we negotiate with, or how we have conversations is not just about individuals, but about the nations that they're a part of.
Thank you, Aviva. Veronica?
Yeah, I think, kind of building on that same theme, we tend as a system, we want to have a template that we apply to everybody. And I think that is the problem. That's part of the problem. We need meaningful relationship, and when we say the word Indigenous, we kind of use it like the word Europeans. But the reality is we are talking different nations. We are talking different languages. It is very diverse. So I think you really have to start to understand what are the issues for those communities, and recognizing that each community are unique and diverse. I talk about Northern Saskatchewan, but I can tell you there is a lot of diversity there. There's, and people will talk, okay, no, I've got this down, I understand this, and sort of try to apply this as one concept, as if Indigenous people are all one. We are not. And I think, we talk about patient-centered, but the reality is we're not really doing that. We really do need to spend that time to build that relationship, to understand what is going on in that community, and how do we work meaningfully with our leadership, within our own communities, as to what the needs are. I think education is definitely a part of that as well, on both ends, both for the providers as well as for the communities, and for our leaders and elders as well. But I also think there needs to be accountability. When you look at the ethics in terms of nursing or physicians or the healthcare system or these health authorities, I don't really believe that they're being lived up to. The care and what's going on, or lack of care, I guess, is horrendous. It's horrific. It's not acceptable. So there is no equitability. And while we may strive for some of these wonderful ethical pieces, we are nowhere near that. And, we're hearing about so many different things over and over and over again. And I think it's an opportunity right now with our, to really take advantage of this. And I think, as providers, this actually gives us a lot more meaning to be able to engage in a really meaningful way, in a relationship way, and work collaboratively. It also takes the pressure off of us, because if we're working with our communities and they're guiding us as well as to what we can do and where we need to go, and we're doing this in a way together, that is a relief in terms that I don't have to come up with all of the answers for everything, that I can share what I have to give, that I will learn from you and we're going to learn back. This is true reciprocity. And, I think even in terms of relationship, I use that word a lot and people use it a lot, but we rarely think about what are we bringing to the table. We're 50% of that relationship. So every time I'm talking to somebody, what am I bringing? How am I offering? How am I receiving? When you think about relationships in terms of marriages, it's tough work, tough slugging out. And we need to do that work in our Indigenous communities to really make sure that we are having that meaningful engagement. And then when we go from there, that reciprocity, that respect for each other's worldviews, however different they may be, and trying to find ways to figure out how do we navigate this together. The more we can do that, the more we're actually going to change that system, the more we're going to have greater vision around opportunities to make things better for everybody. And I actually think, to be perfectly honest, if we do this, if we can make this work with our Indigenous populations, you're going to see it across the board with everybody. I work with a variety of different groups, and it's interesting to me because our approaches that I was always taught as a young girl, and that I practice as part of my traditions, how we approach things, how we work, actually transcribes to many cultures. I've actually found that it just works amazingly well. I've not had a group or a person that it doesn't work with. So it's actually to our benefit to do this as well, because we will gain that meaning and that purpose and that lack of burnout, because we actually are working together as a network, not just on our own.
Thank you, Veronica. And Lori, you have a question?
Thank you. This is just so interesting and it's such a helpful conversation. And so I'd like to thank you all for sharing some of these issues and these problems and helping us understand them. One of the key goals of a research network, we are a research network, is to, or one of the benefits of having a research network is to help inform policy and to generate new knowledge that can then move through the logical steps with the hope to inform policy. What does the panel, I'd like to ask you, what do you think the best research tools could be to start to address some of these issues of equity, similar to what we heard in our first presentation, and maybe, where's this one? Over there, you know, you may want to comment as well. I mean, the kinds of things that we heard about with the snowball kind of that methodology and so on. Could some of these research tools be brought to bear, and how could they be brought to bear to start to address some of these questions?
Yeah, so I have been sitting on different national tables, right? And when you look around and there's no one else there, you know, there's no Inuit there, there's no First Nations, and you're there by yourself. But we as researchers, you know, who work with Indigenous populations, the data belongs to the Indigenous population. So no matter what you're doing, and this is a hard lesson, but it's been a lesson since the 1990s, where data sovereignty. So this is a sovereignty issue, and our people have come to realize that data is valuable and that you need to control the narrative, you know, around how people describe you and why. So what David Dennis was talking about, those larger colonial issues that impact health and what is fairness, right? What do you take into consideration when you see a patient who has this intergenerational? And so the sovereignty piece is a lot around controlling the narrative and having access. But when we look at ODT, and I know there's not a lot of data specific to different groups, but I think we really need to push Health Canada, and we really need to push to get that data broken down so that we have distinctions-based data. So the federal government are passing distinctions-based health legislation, which means that you provide health on a distinctions base. So this pan-Indigenous, as I've said many times before, doesn't work, right? And I think that's where the leadership is important, but the leadership have no money to sit at these tables. So when I'm sitting at the table and I'll say, where are the First Nations, Métis, Inuit leaders? And people say, well, we invited them, but they didn't come. Well, you have to always ask that question, well, why didn't they come? And most of the time it's because there's not enough people. They don't have either enough human resources, or they just can't even find human resources. So we're scrambling. And I think it means that transplant societies, and you have a really important role to play as a collective, that you can go to the federal government and you can put pressure on for that inclusion, you know, and so our elders will say, you know, nothing about us without us, right? And so it's like, if there aren't Indigenous people there, then you have to say why. And if they say, well, because we invited, they didn't show up. Well, did you give them resources? Have you made pathways for that to happen? So I don't know if you guys want to.
I just want to say, from my experience as about research, a while back, I don't know how many years back, researchers would come into our communities and just overstudied us, and then took the information and never came back. We don't know what happened. They never informed us. I think, well, I don't think, I know this. If you want it in community engagement, you have to get the community involved. You have to tell them what you're doing there, and that you will come back and tell them what the results were. I think I know it's going to work, and as I started about like 2014, I started working really closely with researchers because it will work. It does work for our people. And but you need to get the communities involved that you're doing research on.
And just a footnote, I think your randomized control trials, I know there was a big meeting this morning, that there's probably no Indigenous people in those trials.
Yeah.
I guess I would say in terms of research tools, the biggest research tool is the people doing that research and committing to doing that research in a way that includes this perspective. So I'm just going to call out Mary Bocaj's program that she developed with CanSolve CKD. I'm not going to be able to pronounce it right, but the learning pathway through CanSolve CKD that tells, it's like I work in student affairs as well. And we talk about this a lot, that when medical students come in, they have to come in with some knowledge so that they hit the ground running in medical school and they can do all the challenging things that medical school has to offer. Like they have to take, I don't know, chemistry or whatever it is. We argue about what those prerequisites should be. So what are our prerequisites as researchers to start engaging in this? So doing something like the learning pathway that Mary developed, so that we're not just coming to someone like Mary or Carolyn and saying, teach us, that we've actually done some of that work ourselves before we start having that conversation, and following that pathway can be one of the ways where we can make our research, where we can design research from the beginning that's going to be inclusive, and when we, write the grants or whatever, that it's including the money that we need to be able to support elders to be part of that work and that sort of thing. So, I mean, Mary's program is amazing and is developed through the CanSolve CKD partnership to be able to, you can access that before you start coming to communities and asking for their help.
And do you have a question? Is that another question?
Yeah, I'm Ismail Muche, and I'm leading this kidney health education research group, and some of our work is focusing on equity. Just Lori kind of asked what I thought about it. I didn't want to intrude the discussion. I was just waiting if there was anything else what Mary wanted to say before I.
Yeah, Veronica, did you have anything, or Mary, did you have anything to?
Yeah, I was just going to say too, I think the other thing that would be of interest is to see if you can research what's working. Are there things that are working as part of the system? We always look at deficit based, but we also need to look at what are the strengths. And I think that would be, probably very fruitful in some regards, and trying to build upon those strengths about what is working in the communities, but also in the broader context of organ transplantation. I do think that the other piece that, I think of my mom, who was an elder in our community, and she often talked about people would come, in research, in terms of research, people would come and pick her brain and she would share all her knowledge. And then, these individuals are sort of lauded as the experts. I think we have to get away from that as well, and recognizing that the people that you are asking the questions to and providing the answers, they need to be acknowledged in a very meaningful way. And we still don't do that. A lot of this is still very competitive based. It's not about making it better or working with community. And I think some of those pieces we need to change a bit. There have been changes to research in terms of doing it as groups and such, but there's still a lot of that competitiveness. It's really still lacking in the idea that the community owns that knowledge. This is the basis of what they're doing. We are facilitating what they are wanting us to do. And I think we need to make a shift in that system as well.
Mary, did you want to add to?
Sure. Thank you for mentioning the Wabashki-Pichiko-Skanj learning pathway. It's not just me. There's a whole bunch of us who have developed that as patients who felt there was an opportunity to help researchers build the gap. And it's not just for kidney researchers, it's for everybody. But I know a lot of people are scribbling notes. There's two phrases I want you to write down: ethical space and two-eyed seeing. And Google those terms, and those will help you go a long way in terms of understanding more. And I think the cultural safety and cultural understanding aspect is really important in terms of getting a better handle on how you can work with Indigenous communities. And like I say all the time, 75% of the work is going to be working and getting to know and building the relationships. 25% of the work is actually doing the work that you think you came in to do, but the work is also done with us. You could come in with a preconceived notion as a plan of what you want to do, but you really need to consult with us and ask us what we need. And you know, you just spoke about our elders and our knowledge keepers. And we were privileged to have knowledge keepers from across Canada meet together in Vancouver last week and talk about research and, you know, do some really cool things with them and record them, because our elders are getting older. Our knowledge keepers are aging, and we were able to meet with them in 2019. But we felt a sense of urgency in terms of meeting with them now, because we're going to be losing them. And once they're gone, if they haven't passed on that knowledge, it's lost. And it's happening every day in our communities, language, culture, everything. It's being whittled away, and we're trying so hard to recapture it. But yeah, Google those two terms, and that'll help you.
Yeah, so it's a difficult. Okay, interesting. So it's a difficult area, and Lori was asking about what can we tell policymakers, or how can we inform policy? And I think actually probably one of the most important messages is what Mary just said, the 70-75-25, and that's not how CIHR and not how other grants are built. And it's not the timeline that, and then also I think Veronica mentioned this competitiveness, and that's academia. And much of this work is still driven in academia, or is happening in academia, but actually probably the whole approach will need to change. And we and academia and CIHR and CDTRP, we need to find out and need to learn how can be allies in this work. What is our role in helping communities building the capacity to build these conversations and relationships? And then that's what we are trying to do in our work with other communities. But I think this is a key thing, that we need resources to allow knowledge keepers and elders and community representatives to be at the table. Yeah. And we need resources which we will not be able to clearly delineate how much time, how much money, but resources will need to be put in, and that 75% and that patience and that time will eventually build the conversation. And I think it will create the different positions where the negotiations can happen. So I think that's what we will.
And there's a reality that you probably do not realize. So just before COVID, we submitted grants for new research. There's 10 Indigenous research centers across the country. And so we put in for the one in Saskatchewan. And so I went to the Métis communities that had research in the last, I think it was 10 years. So anything that was funded in the last 10 years through the provincial organization or CIHR, and asked them, and I said, what was your experience with research? What do you want to see in this new center? And what we found was there was no organizational memory. There was no community memory of research. And so they would say things like, yes, we had a project, but the person who looked after that project has gone on and now they work for the government, or they work. So building that organizational or community capacity around research is difficult, because what happens is that in our Indigenous organizations, we have money to pay people, but oftentimes it's soft money. So there's no benefits, there's no pension. And so you hire people, often young people, and if they're good at what they do, then what happens is the government or industry see them and say, this is the person we want to hire, offers them 3 times the salary and all benefits. And so what are you going to do if you have a young family? Even though you might want to stay with the Indigenous organization, you won't. So we're this training ground for young people. But when it comes to research, it really slows us down, because there's every time you go. So when you go back if you work with the community over and over again, it helps, but it's really hard when you go back and then you no longer have the same people, or you have high turnover of people at the community level and you're in that, you know. So yeah, Veronica, do you want to answer that as well? Because I know you deal with it also.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's very, you know, what I was talking about before, it's the same thing. We do need to have like that acknowledgement of community, and the idea of, you know, that it really needs to come from community and be community driven. And I absolutely agree. The way that the system is set up is not at all, it's the complete opposite of what is needed. And I think that also leaves the researchers in a very difficult place, because how do you take that time to build those relationships, to spend time in the community, you know, build those face-to-face relationships, and not be you know, have the monies or ways to do that. And as Carolyn said, you know, if you're any good at these types of things, you're going to be pulled in 20 different directions and you will not have that consistency. So it's really challenging. And one of the things that we've tried to do through how we work in Northern Medical Services is to try to have at least a sort of a center or a spinal, like a background, I guess I'm thinking of a spine, so that you can bring people in at different times to be able to work as that common thread throughout. And I think there does need to be some way of doing that. So this is like a whole different way of thinking. It's a real shift. But I think this is what we need to be aiming for. But I also, again, I will come back to the idea as researchers. I mean, I would love to work in that manner, in that way where this is recognized, and that, you know, we can take that time and really get to know what's going on and working with our communities. Our communities are hungry for it. But I think equally our researchers and our students are hungry for this too. They want to be able to do that. And the limitation is the academia, the system that has been created and is still proliferated, unfortunately.
So we're out of time, I see. And so I'll just give it back to our three panel members if there's any last words that you have. And if Terri, if you could close us out as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to say one real quick thing, and I do know we're over time. So I was, if you haven't read this, I recommend reading Peggy McIntosh's piece called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is about privilege, and it was written back in 1989. And one of the quotes that she has in there is that she says, "I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group." And I think that probably reflected what I was taught as a child of the 80s about racism, that I'm not racist because I would never say or do this thing. But I guess as, you know, I've grown and learned and society has changed, I think we now see things very differently. And just as a reflection, my kids come home from school and, you know, I'm from Winnipeg. There's this melty season between a winter and spring where everything's slushy. And I was complaining about it one day and my kid said, "Well, we're in the thaw. You know, Indigenous people have 6 seasons, not 4, and this is the thaw." And I was like, okay, I'd never learned that in school. And I learned from them about the thaw. And I think that's where we are in health research now, is in the thaw. Things that were frozen before and invisible, we're now recognizing them and bringing them to the surface. So I think there's a lot of hope. We're in the thaw.
Okay, I'm going to read this prayer and then I'll say a small prayer in my language. This is for organ transplant. Strengthen me, Holy One, on my journey through illness. Steady my steps on this difficult path. Bring me through signposts of remedies and therapies. Secure in your guidance as I face these changes. You are my strength and my hope, the author of my healing. You are my promise and my courage, guiding my helpers as I move toward healing. Kinanaskom koesa nos mantu yuaska piota nimamichini pia piano ipiuita mago gita tagagui tahago ni tsanak igui kakitmak sichaguma kama mai pai kakiogi goi mata katsukapinau mantu ita ichihiguya tamamsia mantu kapita mitsahaya igasti tawichi hituya kakio. Hi.
Thank you, Terri. And thanks everyone. And you know, I've been living up in the bush and I'm balancing on my shoes. It's weird to be past COVID and actually in heels. So yeah, so I made it through without falling over. But thank you so much, everybody, for this. And we look forward to more conversations.